In today's video, I wanted to talk to you about what it has been like owning this beautiful Leica Q2 for the past 4 years or so. And more precisely, I want to talk to you about the 5 phases that I think most Leica Q owners, doesn't matter which generation, will experience at some point. Now, this video isn't meant to be taken too seriously. It's more of an opinion, and maybe none of the phases that I'm going to mention will apply to you. But anyway, let's just get into it. So the process of owning a Leica Q2 actually started out with what would best be described as some sort of disbelief. For me personally, that is simply because the Leica Q2 in particular has been sort of a grail camera, or had been sort of a grail camera at the point that I bought it back in 2021 for many years. And for most of those years, it was actually completely out of reach, just financially speaking, for me. This was a very expensive camera, and the Leica Q3 still is a very expensive camera. And even a Leica Q2 nowadays on the secondhand market isn't exactly cheap. Now, a lot cheaper obviously than what it was brand new, but not cheap in the grand scheme of things. And so for most of my life, it was actually completely impossible to spend this much money on a camera. But in 2020, I actually finished law school, and then I started working. And shortly after that, my then girlfriend, now wife, also started working. And so we had 2 incomes and very little financial responsibilities. And so that meant that things just got a little bit more relaxed. And for the first time in my life, I really had some leftover cash that I could just do with whatever I wanted, essentially. And so in 2021, I was actually able to buy a Leica Q2 fairly easily. And when I got the Leica Q2 and I had it in my hands, I was sort of in disbelief that I was actually able to own this camera, because it just had been something that I was dreaming of for so long. And it felt like I had reached the end of a road that I was sort of expecting to never end. And then in front of me, there was a new horizon and an intersection, and I didn't exactly know which way would lead where. But that phase of disbelief was obviously just very short-lived. It was probably a few days, if that. And so very quickly after that, the second phase of owning the Leica Q2 began. And that second phase was disappointment. You see, if you want to have something for so long and it costs this much money, you really want it to be perfect. And at the time of buying the Leica Q2, my main or most used camera of that time for photography was the Fuji X100V. And so I was essentially sort of expecting that the Leica Q2 would be every bit as good as the Fuji X100V, and then a hell of a lot better. More resolution, full frame sensor, stabilized lens, you name it, it's got it. But I was kind of disappointed at first. And that was actually for the simple reason that while shooting the X100V for, well, a couple of years actually, I got pretty used to having a nice looking image on my screen right after I had taken the screen. Now, when I first got this Leica Q2, it was actually on firmware 1 probably, I'm not quite sure. I certainly didn't update the firmware right away. But yeah, with the firmware that I had at the time in particular, but even now, so even today, the straight out of camera JPEGs are, well, not as good as the ones that you can get out of a Fuji with all of the customizability, the custom recipes and everything. And so what that meant was, for one, that I had to get back into Lightroom editing. And if you are sort of new to Lightroom editing, or you haven't done it for a couple of years, it's actually a bit of a process. So I wasn't really happy with the edits that I got, but more importantly, I was simply not happy with the images in the moment that I was taking them. And so around the time that I got the Leica Q2, it was actually fall or closer to winter time, and so I was taking most of my images indoors in artificial light conditions, and the auto white balance is particularly bad, or was particularly bad, on the Leica Q2, meaning that even in warmer light situations, the auto white balance just kicked in and made everything look very neutral. So a very neutral sort of white light. And so just picture this, you're sitting in a cafe, in a restaurant with your family, you got your new camera out, it cost you just, I don't know, 5.5 grand or something, or 6 grand even, I don't know. And so you're taking a couple of snaps just of your friends and family, whoever is around, in a lovely place, you know, loads of warm, soft light around, everything just looks very pleasing. And obviously, when you're taking a picture of someone, they usually want to see it as well. And so you're showing it to them on the screen, and you can just see the excitement fade from their faces, just the look of utter disappointment, because the images on the back of the screen was looking super harsh, the light was all wrong, everything looked just messed up, especially again in those indoor situations in artificial light. And so that was obviously just no fun. It was not just that, of course. At first, I also really struggled to make good use of the 28mm focal length. It just seemed way too wide, coming from the 35mm equivalent of my Fuji X100V. And then, of course, there were other things that weren't exactly perfect, like the autofocusing system and the metering. And so looking back, if you watch the first two videos comparing the Leica Q2 to the Fuji X100V that I did back in those days, I think you can really see that I was sort of struggling with the Leica Q2. Now, I did like it even initially just because of how it looks, how it feels, and I really wanted to give it a chance, and I was hoping that at some point I would be able to make good use of it. But truth be told, if I hadn't been waiting to be able to buy that camera for so long, and also just seen other people, both in my personal life but also online, just churn out great photos with this camera, I probably would have just thought that, okay, marketing has gotten the better of me, this camera is obviously a piece of shit, it's completely overhyped, and I would have probably just sold it right away. And that's actually what I heard from quite a number of people who decided to buy a Leica Q2 or Leica Q3 after watching some of my videos, and they just told me that they were completely disappointed by the camera and that they are selling it and that they want to get something else. However, with that being said, I'm very happy that I did not sell this camera, because after that initial phase of disappointment, there came the third phase, which was just absolute bliss. After a few weeks or so, I managed to set up a few presets which made editing my photos just a lot easier with Leica Q2, which helped me to get better results initially. Also, there was a huge firmware update which helped with the images straight out of camera. Also, there were some improvements in regard to the metering and the auto white balance. And so all of that was much appreciated, but perhaps most importantly, I somehow figured out just over time and with trial and error how to use that 28mm lens. And once I got comfortable using just a 28mm lens and nothing else, that's when I really started to fall in love with the Leica Q2. Now, obviously, with the 47MP sensor and the 28mm f1.7 Summilux lens, you can get some great images just in regards to the quality. And even to this day, those images from just an image qualities perspective can certainly still hold up. You also get that lens stabilization as well to help you in low light situations. The fast aperture even allows for a bit of bokeh, and 28mm again, once you get used to it, it is just an incredibly versatile focal length, especially for stuff like POV photography and just documenting your everyday life. But that is of course not all. This camera looks amazing and it is built like an absolute tank. And so I quickly got used to simply always taking it with me and using it in all kinds of conditions without hesitation, which is just incredibly liberating. If you spend this kind of money on a camera, you want to be using it all the time. But that is only possible if you can trust this camera to survive, even if you take it out in the rain, for example, for a couple of hours on end. Which is what I have done I don't know how many times, and it has never missed a beat. Now that is in part due to the fact that unlike most cameras, this Leica Q2 actually comes with an IP52 rating, and so you just know that it actually really is water and dust resistant. And it's not just on a sort of trust me bro basis like it is with most cameras. Like, for example, this Sony a7 IV is fairly weather resistant as well, but I have no idea how weather resistant because it just simply doesn't have a rating. It's just, well, it's weather resistant enough to the point that it isn't. And then it will just die, I guess. So yeah, simple things like having an IP rating on your camera really helps to build that trust that you really do need if you want to use something that is this expensive in, let's say, less than ideal conditions. And so for a few years, that was sort of it. I took this camera absolutely everywhere. I carried it with me every single day in my bag or backpack, just in my day-to-day life. But I also took it with me to New York, Iceland, to the Netherlands, England, France, Sweden, just to name a few, and I loved every second of it. For at least 3 years or so, I was pretty much not using any other camera for photography. Yes, I also had a Fuji X-T4 and I also bought a Sony a7 IV, but I only used those cameras to shoot videos for this channel and not really for photography. And so there I was. I had managed to buy the camera of my dreams, and after just a short-lived initial period of sort of struggling to really use and enjoy this camera, I was completely in love with it. I loved using it, I loved the results that I got from it, I loved just everything about it for a number of years. But eventually, that feeling of just being done with buying cameras for photography sort of faded, because what started out as a very rewarding creative challenge of having nothing other than a 28mm lens all of the time, over the years turned into, well, a limitation, I suppose. And now this point is perhaps really obvious to some of you, but again, I can't stress enough just how much I enjoyed those limitations at first. But once you really get used to using one particular lens and it just becomes second nature, it's also just a routine using it. It's not creatively challenging any longer, and that makes it boring, I suppose. And so yeah, while I was still getting good results while using this camera in my day-to-day life, while traveling and so on and so forth, or I get good results. I was happy with my results, which is probably even more important. If they are good, I don't know. That's not on me to decide really. But anyway, be that as it may, I was happy with the results that I got, but I was starting to lose interest in the process of using this camera simply because it wasn't challenging any longer. And so I guess I felt like those limitations were starting to hinder my creative growth, if you like. It was just keeping me from experiencing and using other focal length and finding ways to make those work in any given situation as well. So I guess you could say that this second phase of disappointment wasn't really me being disappointed with the camera itself, but sort of being disappointed with the fact that this would not be my one and done photography camera for the rest of my life. And so over the past few months, I've actually started to use my Sony a7 IV a lot more for photography. And as it turns out, behind its very boring and passionless and uninspiring facade and design, it's actually quite an enjoyable, very capable, and dare I say it, even fun to use camera. So I've been really enjoying using this Sony a7 IV, especially with this Zeiss 55mm lens. It's one of my all-time favorites. But even with that camera, it has to be said that despite how capable it is, I'm not really 100% into it. There's just something missing. An itch that it doesn't scratch. There's just some demand that it doesn't satisfy. And so I'm still on the lookout for another camera that gives me the same sort of hype, if you like, the same sort of enjoyment that I got with the Leica Q2 for so many years after that initial phase of growing pain. But where does that leave us with the Leica Q2. Does that mean that I don't like it anymore? Does that mean that I am perhaps going to sell it or not use it any longer? And that brings us to the last phase, and that is acceptance. So I have now accepted that this is not the only camera that I want to use in my life, even though it is kind of a one and done camera solution. It's still my favorite everyday carry camera, so the best camera that I have ever used to just have on you every day to document your everyday life. I absolutely love it for that. And also I could never sell it. I am so emotionally attached to this particular Leica Q2. This is the camera that I carried and shot photos with on my own wedding. I used it on our honeymoon and on, well, all of our holidays and vacations over the past 4 years. It is the camera that I took with me when our son was born, and the camera that I used to take the very first pictures of our little baby boy. It's the camera that took the last portrait, as far as I'm aware, of my granddad before he passed away, and I am probably about as emotionally attached to this camera as you can be to any object. And so no, I'm not going to sell it. I'm still going to use this camera. I still do love it for what it is, but I have come to terms with the fact that this is not going to be my one and done camera. Now, I am fairly sure what my next camera purchase is going to be, but that's a topic for another video. However, I would love to know if any of those phases that I just mentioned rung a bell with you, especially if you also own either a Leica Q2 or maybe you had a similar experience with the Fuji X100 5, 6, whichever it may be. Let me know. And also if you have any suggestions for great cameras that might fit my bill that I should check out, also feel free to leave them in the comments down below. But yeah, as I said earlier, my next camera purchase is pretty much set in stone, so I'm most likely not going to change that. However, that's all I got for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was interesting to you, and I'll see you in another one. Until then, take good care. Bye.